Darkcast Network, bringing our indie podcasts out of the shadows. This episode was requested by one of our listeners, so thank you, Nikki Brae, for suggesting this case.
Welcome, wee ones, to Scottish Murders. Dawn will shortly be taking you through a solved or unsolved murder involving people from or living in Scotland. So get ready to hear about the darker side of bonnie Scotland.
The clock hands in the office of William Johnston, a partner at J&G Johnston Linen Manufacturers in East Weems, showed it was almost 12:50 p.m, and William noted that the office clerk, Michael Brown, had not returned from the bank by 12 noon as usual. Minutes later, news reached the linen manufacturers and William that either a suicide or murder had taken place in the public lavatory on School Wynd. And so William, now concerned for Michael, went to investigate. East Weems, according to Visit Scotland, is a village situated in the south-east of Fife on the east of Scotland. It lies on the Firth of Forth and is a 14-minute drive north-east of Kirkcaldy. The Brown family were very well known in East Weems, with generations of their family having resided there. However, William Brown, his wife and 6 children briefly moved to the nearby town of Buckhaven, but in 1907 moved back to Station Road in East Weems. Upon the family moving back to East Weems, one of their children, Michael, who was known as Mickey Swinton Brown, who was 14 at this time, left school and began working as a junior clerk in the counting house of the linen manufacturers J&G Johnston, who were located on the seafront of East Weems and who employed over 200 workers. Among both his fellow employees at the factory as well as his bosses, wee Mickey was very well liked, described in an article in the Leaven Advertiser and Weems Gazette as being a bright and cheerful lad, with an old head on his young shoulders, despite in 1909 looking much younger than his 16 years of age. The employees at the linen manufacturers were paid weekly on a Friday, and since the introduction of tram cars in the area 2.5 years prior, which included stops at East Weems and Buckhaven, each Friday the junior clerk in the counting house would travel to the Royal Bank of Scotland in Buckhaven, a town located about 1.7 miles or 2.7 kilometres north of East Weems, to collect the weekly wage, which could be anything from £80 to £150, which in today's money would be about £8,000 to £14,200 or $9,900 to $17,600. On Friday, the 19th of February 1909, it was 16-year-old Michael Brown's turn to make the trip to the bank to collect the weekly wages. And so, about 10:30 a.m, Michael left the linen manufacturers with a cheque for £85 or $105 to cash and a brief bag to carry the money in on his return. Michael caught the 10:45 a.m. tram at the top of School Wynd in East Weems and travelled the 10 minutes to Buckhaven before alighting the tram and making his way to the bank. Here he handed over the cheque and said that he would come back, giving the bank staff enough time to get the money ready. He then had a wee walk around Buckhaven before heading back to the bank, where he collected £25 in single notes, £20 in half sovereigns, and £40 in silver, which made up the £85 or $105, which in today's money would be about £8,100 or $10,000. He then left the bank and walked to Station Road in order to catch the 11:45 a.m. tram back to East Weems. As he waited for the tram, he was joined by Alexander Edmonston. The pair knew each other as they both lived with their families in East Weems, and Alexander had worked as a carter before, where he had delivered to the linen manufacturers, and so they said hello to each other. Tram 1 then arrived, and the pair got on to the empty tram. At the next stop, 14-year-old Peter Adamson, who was a messenger boy, got on. Peter knew Michael and Alexander, and they all exchanged hellos, before Peter then got off at the next stop, leaving Michael and Alexander alone in the tram again with the conductor, Mr. Chalmers. At 11:55 a.m, tramcar 1 arrived back at the stop at the top of School Wynd in East Weems, and Michael alighted first from the tram, followed by Alexander, and both Michael and Alexander were seen at the top of School Wynd by a miner and baker's van man who had stopped to have a chat. Michael then began walking down the steep brae of School Wynd towards the linen manufacturers located on the seafront. However, Michael wasn't alone. 23-year-old Alexander Edmonston, who was the eldest child of Walter and Mrs. Edmonston. The family were originally from Edinburgh, but had moved to East Weems 8 years prior. Alexander still lived with his mum and dad, as well as his widowed sister and her young daughter. Neighbours of the family described Alexander as a man who could work, but often would not. Certainly for the first 2 months of 1909, Alexander had worked for only 2 weeks as a labourer at a brewery, and his mum had told him on the morning of Friday the 19th of February 1909, before he left the house after his breakfast, according to an article in the Fiechter Advertiser on the 27th of February 1909, that things could not go on as they were, and that you must get work by Monday, or you will have to leave, for we cannot keep ourselves, much less you. And so with those words ringing in his ears, Alexander left the family home that morning, telling his mother that he was going for a sail from Methil Port, a neighbouring village, with neither himself or his mother thinking that he would never return. Michael Brown made his way down the School Wynd brae, either with Alexander Edmonston following him or having made the decision to walk with Michael. However, when the pair came to the public lavatory, about halfway down School Wynd, whether by design on Alexander's part or by force, Michael and Alexander went inside. Once inside, Alexander carried out a brutal attack on the young Michael, so severe that upon his boss, William Johnston, becoming aware of the situation and attempting to identify the body, he was only able to do this by Michael's clothing, as his face was beyond recognition. Upon brutally murdering Michael, Alexander then grabbed the brief bag containing the £85 or $105, and first checking that no one was around outside, he left the lavatory, knowing full well that he would not now be able to go home. The beaten-up body of 16-year-old Michael Swinton Brown was found within half an hour of him alighting from the tramcar at 11:55 a.m. by 9-year-old John Morgan, who had been walking up the brae and happened to enter the lavatory. Upon discovering the horrific scene and Michael's body, he immediately ran out and shouted, "Here's a boy murdered!" The lavatory walls, according to the Leaven Advertiser and Weems Gazette, were built of stone slabs and had an inner and outer chamber, with only a roof being over the inner chamber and not the outer chamber where the urinal was. Michael's body had been dragged into the inner chamber, gagged by thrusting his own cap into his mouth, strangled with a handkerchief, battered about the head to death with a lethal weapon, and an attempt had been made to jam his body in one of the 2 holes of the seat. And this is how Alex Sigley, a chimney sweep who was working in the vicinity, found Michael's body, following hearing young John Morgan's cry about there being a boy murdered. Realising just how dire the situation was, he left the lavatory in order to summon help, with a local police constable arriving on the scene almost immediately. Finding no sign of life, the officer lifted the body from its cramped position to the outer chamber, at this point noticing 2 large pools of blood where the body had been. It was also observed that there was an ugly cut above the left eye that had disfigured the face. There were marks of violence behind the ears, and the head bore at least half a dozen marks, which indicated that the head had been violently kicked with a heavy booted foot. Although realising that, sadly, the unrecognisable boy was dead, the officer called for the local doctor, Dr. Watson, to attend the scene, and upon attending, he pronounced life to be extinct, and that it had likely happened soon after receiving the severe blows. With the severity of the attack having left the body unidentifiable, despite many who had since congregated around the lavatory being asked to take a look at the body to see if they could identify it, it was assumed that the victim had been a non-resident in the village, and so it was decided that the body be taken to the nearby cemetery to await identification and for the post-mortem to be carried out. It was as Michael's body was being transported to the cemetery that the news made it to Michael's bosses and fellow employees at the linen manufacturers that there either had been a suicide or a murder in the lavatory on School Wynd. Michael's boss, William Johnston, being concerned for Michael's welfare, with him now being over an hour late back from the bank, made his way to the cemetery to hopefully satisfy himself that the body wasn't of Michael and that Michael had just been held up. As William made his way to the cemetery, word left the manufacturers of Michael's lateness, which led those in the village to speculate that the body could be Michael Brown's. And so everyone waited for William Johnston to return from the cemetery, hoping that there was nothing in the rumour that was spreading like wildfire that the murder victim could be that of 16-year-old Michael Swinton Brown. Sadly, that was not the case, and while William Johnston was unable to identify Michael due to the severe attack, he instantly recognised the clothing to be that of Michael's, and he was overcome with sadness to see what had been done to a lad who he and all at the linen manufacturers were very fond of, as Michael was known to be honest, painstaking at his work, and always happy. William Johnston so cared about his young clerk as well as his family that he sent word that his mother was to be told in as kind a way as possible about what had happened to her boy, a mere 100 yards or 91 metres from his home. While the devastating news that it had been Michael's body spread to a shocked village, while the factory bosses announced that everyone could have the remainder of the day off, while many villagers gathered on School Wynd, and while the Brown family's lives were shattered, the hunt was on to find Michael's killer. Upon identifying the body as being Michael, William Johnston immediately told the police of Michael's journey that morning to the bank and that he would have been carrying a significant amount of money in a brief bag. Upon finding this information out and the lavatory being checked, it was discovered that the brief bag full of money Michael would have been carrying was missing, along with his distinctive gunmetal watch and chain, and so robbery was quickly established as the motive. Up to this point, being about 3 p.m, the lavatory had remained open and unmanned, and so many locals had had the chance to go into the lavatory and have a look, although they quickly emerged again when they were faced with pools of blood on the floor and splattered on the walls, with evidence that Michael's head and face had come into violent contact with the walls of the lavatory. However, eventually it was thought it best if the lavatory was boarded up and a police officer was tasked to guard it until such time the scene could be examined, and when it was, a perfect hand and fingerprint was found in the blood-soaked woodwork next to that of a child's handprint, thought to be Michael's. With the body now being identified and the motive being thought to have been robbery, the police officers then began seeking witnesses to Michael's journey that morning to see if anything could lead to who the murderer was, and it wouldn't take long for a strong potential suspect to emerge. While there were no witnesses to Michael and his attacker entering or leaving the lavatory, despite it being surrounded on 3 sides by homes, and despite it being in the middle of the day, someone working in the vicinity of the lavatory heard shuffling and gasping noises coming from the lavatory shortly after 12 noon, but didn't think anything of it and didn't investigate. However, Michael Brown was seen at the top of School Wynd by 2 men who had stopped for a chat, and they said that they had seen Alexander Edmondson there at the same time. Next, the police wanted to interview those on the tram that would have taken Michael Brown from Buckhaven back to East Weems, where Michael alighted at the top of School Wynd brae. However, there initially was some confusion about which tram Michael had been on. Michael had been on tram 1, however the conductor of tram 2 was interviewed first, and he said that 2 men had alighted from his tram at East Weems at the top of School Wynd, and that 1 man was wearing a light dust overcoat. And so the police, believing that one of these men had been Michael, likely being followed by his murderer, initially focused their attention on the owner of the light dust overcoat. While this man was being sought, the conductor of tram 1 and its passengers were interviewed, and the conductor, Mr. Chalmers, also said that 2 men had left his tram at the School Wynd stop and set off down the brae, one following the other. When 9-year-old Peter Adamson, the only other passenger who had been on tram 1 at the same time as Michael Brown, was interviewed, he confirmed that Michael had been on the 11:45 a.m. tram 1 with him. and so had Alexander Edmonston. It was at this point the man in the dust overcoat who had been identified by the conductor in tram 2 was ruled out, and Alexander Edmonston became their prime suspect, especially as officers had visited his parents' home and upon asking about his whereabouts being told that they didn't know and that they hadn't seen him since that morning. Alexander's parents could not believe that their son was the man the police were looking for, telling them that Alexander had said he was going to Methyl Docks that day for a sale and that he wasn't even in the area. Methyl Docks is located less than a mile or 1.4 kilometres northeast of Buckhaven. Upon officers going to Methyl Docks and asking if someone matching Alexander's description had been there that day, they were told no one had seen him. In fact, nobody had seen Alexander since he was spotted at the top of School Wynd just after 12 noon, following alighting the tram. But his parents still couldn't believe he was involved and said that he often took himself off for days on end without being in touch with his family, and that it couldn't possibly have been Alexander who had been seen leaving the tram at School Wynd. However, the police believed that they now had their murderer, and it was Alexander Edmonston. From witnesses being spoken to and a search that had been organised between 3 and 4 by police officers and locals, it was established that upon leaving the lavatory on School Wynd, Alexander then made his way northeast through Macduff Cemetery and onto the Macduff Castle ruins, as it was in the whins, which are gorse bushes, near the Macduff Castle ruins, that the brief bag that Michael had carried was discovered, which was about a 7-minute walk away from where Michael had been brutally murdered. While a description of Alexander Edmonston was circulated by telephone and telegraph wires to every police station of note throughout the country late on the Friday evening, a search for Alexander in the surrounding areas continued into the evening in an effort to find Michael's murderer before nightfall. However, nightfall came, and despite officers keeping surveillance on the Edmonston family home through the night in case Alexander tried to make contact with his family, despite an officer being posted on School Wynd, and despite a continued search going on through the night, as day broke on Saturday the 20th of February, Alexander was still a wanted man. A wanted man many felt had now left the area. However, a new day also brought a description of Alexander having now been released to the public, and it wasn't long before witnesses were coming forward to report sightings of a man matching the description being circulated, which read, according to the Leaven Advertiser and Weems Gazette on the 24th of February 1909, 23 years of age, 5 foot 9 inches in height, hair auburn, eyes dark, face fully ruddy, without whiskers or moustache. Dress, brown jacket suit, seat of trousers patched, sweater with fall-down collar, which he wears turned up and fastened with a safety pin, green cap, black lacing boots, once 3 teeth in front of upper jaw, and the letters A and E tattooed on right forearm. Due to the sightings that the police would receive throughout Saturday morning, a picture of Alexander's movements following fleeing the murder scene began to emerge. Upon Alexander leaving the murder scene, it was believed, according to the Leaven Advertiser and Weems Gazette on the 24th of February 1909, he entered a wooded area near the scene, before making his way along a burn that ran at such a low level that he would have been hidden from view. He then made his way to the cemetery, which is a 5-minute walk from School Wynd, before entering fields of whins where he would have passed unobserved, and in amongst these whins he discarded the brief bag. It is then believed he passed through the nearby Macduff Castle ruins before making his way through the fields and Weems Woods above East Weems, where he was sighted about 12:30 p.m. Alexander was next spotted by a Mr. and Mrs. Cumming, who exchanged a hello with a seedy-looking man who matched Alexander's description, not realising he was a wanted man at this point, at the standing stones on the high road between Kirkcaldy and Leaven, about a 25-minute walk northwest from Macduff Castle ruins. Alexander then walked for some time through vast fields, miles from homes or roads, until coming across 82-year-old Mr. Hardy, who lived in one of a few nearby cottages and was out for a walk. Here, Alexander asked Mr. Hardy for a clothes brush and some water, but Mr. Hardy declined to help him and Alexander hurried off. He next was spotted about 2 p.m. near Thornton, about 5 miles or 8 kilometres from where he had been spotted by Mr. Hardy by 2 separate people, who witnessed a dog run up to him barking. He then walked across more fields and woods until he reached nearby Thornton, which is about 6.4 miles or 10.2 kilometres west of East Weems. From Thornton, he walked north along the main road from Kirkcaldy to Cooper as far as New Inn, a walk of about 1 hour and 40 minutes. Then he walked another 51 minutes northwest on a back road to Falkland, where he made his way past the end of Falkland Palace, skirted the palace walls, and continued walking another 59 miles northwest to Strathmiglo. And this was his next lucky break, as the police officer at Strathmiglo had yet to be informed about the murder that had taken place in East Weems, and so Alexander was free to go about undetected. Here he visited 2 shops, and using some of the money he had stolen, he bought a tweed jacket suit, a showerproof coat, a dark grey cap, and a green muffler. Before leaving the shops, Alexander put his new showerproof coat on, which would have covered any blood that was on his clothing, and his new grey cap. At 6:18 p.m, Alexander was on the move again, this time getting a train from Strathmiglo to Mawcarse Junction, located an 8-minute journey southwest. He was then seen at Milnathort, which was a 5-minute journey southwest. The station master observed that Alexander was carrying a brown bundle under his arm, which would have been his new clothes. He then took another train from Milnathort to Bridge of Erne, located a 39-minute journey north, and he was seen again at Bridge of Erne, where he took a train to Perth, located a 16-minute journey northwest and known as the Fair City. With Perth being a city and Alexander likely being exhausted, having not only murdered someone that day, but also having quite the journey, he likely felt he had a good chance of remaining undetected, and so he made his way to a temperance hotel where he stayed for the night. Temperance hotels, according to helensboroughheritage.co.uk, aimed to provide people with various amenities of a standard hotel except the alcohol, and they formed a highly visible and important part of the wider temperance movement. On Saturday morning, Alexander must have begun to feel uneasy, as about 9 a.m. he was on the move again. Now, back in East Weems on Friday, while Alexander is getting further and further away, the hunt for him is continuing, albeit slowly and with a slight delay in searching for him due to the wrong men initially being identified as being Michael and Alexander by the conductor in tram number 2, and the police knew that with every hour that passed without finding Alexander Edmonston, there was a chance they may not be able to track him down. And so despite the chief constable having every faith in his police force, on Friday evening he sent a wire to Major Richardson in London requesting that he attend East Weems with his well-known bloodhounds. Major Richardson was happy to oblige and promptly arrived in East Weems with his 2 bloodhounds on Saturday at 6 a.m. However, he was disappointed to note that a thin layer of frost was on the ground, which was not ideal for his bloodhounds to be able to pick up a trail. However, they must try. And so at 7:30 a.m, with Alexander Edmonston now having been on the run for at least 17 hours, the police, Major Richardson and his bloodhounds, made their way first to the Edmonstons' home in order to acquire clothing with a scent of Alexander on it. Despite Mr. and Mrs. Edmonston being extremely distressed with the situation that their son found himself in, they were eager to help. However, Mrs. Edmonston advised them that there was no unwashed clothing of Alexander's to give them, and so the Major directed them to a pillow on Alexander's bed instead. And so taking the pillow with them, the party set out, firstly taking the dogs to the areas where they knew Alexander had passed through, being the cemetery and the field of whins where the brief bag had been found. The dogs were let off the leash and everyone's hopes were immediately up as the dogs were seen to be giving tongue, a sure sign that they had struck the trail. The dogs then led the group on past Macduff Castle ruins and through a field towards the main road and a wooded area. However, it soon became evident that the dogs had lost the scent of Alexander, and so the dogs were taken back to the main road, where again they picked up a scent briefly before losing it again. The group, by this time being followed by a large number of curious locals, either walking or on bicycles, walked towards where Alexander had been spotted by Mr. and Mrs. Cumming near the Standing Stones Road. Over the road, the dogs again picked up a scent, and the group walked on for a considerable distance in silence, hoping that they were closing in on the killer. It was noted by many that the area they had found themselves walking through was tough terrain and very deserted, with not a house or road in sight. The group next came out at the cottages, where 82-year-old Mr. Hardy had been approached by Alexander the day before, asking if he could have some water and a clothes brush. When questioned, Mr. Hardy said that while he wasn't willing to give Alexander Edmonston water or a clothes brush, he directed him to his next-door neighbour, saying that Alexander had knocked on the next-door neighbour's door so quietly he wasn't heard, before he then hurried round the back of the cottages and headed along the road. Mr. Hardy said that he hadn't noticed any sign of blood on Alexander's clothing. At this point, the dogs lost the trail, but upon taking the path Mr. Hardy said Alexander had taken round the back of the cottages and along the nearby road, the scent was picked up again, with the dogs leading the group for about 5 miles over rough ground and through woods before coming out near Thornton to the spot where Alexander had been seen the previous day by 2 young women when a dog had run up to him and barked loudly. When one of the women was questioned, she said that Alexander had been walking pretty fast, making west in a slouching manner, with his cap pulled low over his eyes. They also saw no bloodstains on his clothing, but they hadn't noticed his feet, but did say that he looked shabby. Shortly after this, the dogs lost the scent again. The group and dogs had a rest and refreshments at Thornton before resuming their efforts again. However, with the time that had passed and the frost that had lain on the ground, the hunt was abandoned at 3 p.m, and Major Richardson and his bloodhounds returned once again to London on Saturday night. By this time, however, the description of Alexander Edmonston had now reached far and wide, and the telephone bell at the police station was seldom silent, with sightings of him being reported. Following receiving information that Alexander had bought new clothing in Strathmiglo, any sightings of Alexander wearing the new clothing could also be included as relevant information. They also now had received sightings of him at various train stations, and that he had last been seen at Perth Station. And so Detective Nicholl and Deputy Chief Constable Scott made their way to Perth early in the morning of Saturday the 20th of February and visited temperance hotels and lodges in Perth, asking if anyone matching Alexander's description had been there. While the officers initially had no luck, they soon received word that a guest who had stayed at a temperance hotel in Perth on a Friday night, upon reading the morning papers and seeing a description of the wanted man, had informed the police that a man matching the description in appearance and age had stayed at the same temperance hotel as himself on Friday evening. The detective and deputy chief constable immediately went to this temperance hotel in the hope of apprehending Alexander Edmonston, only to be told by the guest that he had left the temperance hotel at 9 a.m. that morning. As it was now only about 10 a.m, the officers felt like they were closing in on the wanted man, and so predicting that he would likely have headed to Perth Central Station in order to flee the area, officers hurriedly made their way there, where they were pleased to discover that a man matching Alexander's description had indeed purchased a train ticket, a ticket for the 9:35 a.m. intermediate train heading to Edinburgh, a journey that would take about an hour and 32 minutes. And so there was just time to contact the Edinburgh Constabulary with this information, who in turn immediately rushed to Edinburgh train station and were just in time to meet the train from Perth. All they had to do now was wait for the man who matched the description of the wanted man that had been circulated to come off the train. And so they waited and waited, but despite scrutinising every face that came off the train from Perth, there was no sign of Alexander Edmonston or anyone matching his description. So that's the end of part 1. Part 2 covers the aftermath and goings-on in East Wemyss following the murder of Michael Brown. The hunt for Alexander Edmonston continues, and we find out where he actually was when police were waiting to apprehend him off the train at Edinburgh. So join me next time for the conclusion to the Michael Brown murder.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.